College seminar. Hillsdale College is distinguished by its commitment to the liberal arts, Western culture, and the American heritage of freedom. For over 150 years, it has refused federal funding and has admitted students regardless of race, sex, or origin, or of government mandates. If you would like more information about tapes or about Hillsdale College, call toll-free 1-800-437-2268.
Good morning. My name is Lucas Miller. I'm a senior, double majoring in religion and psychology. And this morning our speaker is David Blankenhorn. He is a founder and president of the Institute for American Values, a private, nonpartisan organization devoted to research and public education on family and social issues. USA Today has described Mr. Blankenhorn as leading a grassroots movement to strengthen marriage. He has co-edited 4 books of essays, including The Fatherhood Movement, published in 1999. In 1994, he helped to found the National Fatherhood Initiative, of which he became chairman. In 1992, he was appointed by President Bush to serve on the National Commission on Americans' Urban Families. Mr. Blankenhorn's articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today. He has appeared on Oprah, 2020, and CBS This Morning. He is a magna cum laude graduate in social studies from Harvard and has an MA in comparative social history from the University of Warwick in Coventry, England. The topic of his talk this morning is political freedom and private virtue. Please welcome Mr. David Blankenhorn.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be with you this morning. Thanks for coming. Here is my proposition. In the past 10 years, the most important trend in U.S. public life has been what I want to call today the triumph of politics. The triumph of politics. By the triumph of politics, I mean a way of seeing the world such that politics and pursuing one's political agenda becomes the highest and most important sphere of social life. It becomes the way, the primary way, the ultimate way in which we as a society understand and determine who we are and where we are going. And I want to suggest to you today that the irony or the troubling aspect of the triumph of politics is that it has generated a widespread sense of alienation and cynicism about politics. So that you get this funny situation where the elevation of politics into the highest sphere produces among so many people a sense of alienation, frustration, cynicism about politics itself. That's the thesis I want to talk to you about, and I want to relate it to the theme of morality and political freedom by discussing this proposition. Now, like a preacher with a sermon, I begin with a text, a reading, not inappropriately given our subject from yesterday's New York Times, the op-ed page, by Professor Stanley Fish, who's the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Illinois, and he writes yesterday in the New York Times about the business in Florida, the election conflict in Florida that we've all been following. And he says, this is a quote, "Bush and Gore partisans who use any available argument to help their man and change their argument if circumstances change are doing the right thing. They have their eyes on the right goal. not the implementation of a procedure that will be fair to everyone. There is no such procedure. That's why we have politics. But the victory, at least for 4 years, of the ideas and politics they think are essential to the health of the nation. Some are now urging that we stop playing politics. But if either candidate were to stop playing politics, he would be performing an immoral act, because he would be abandoning the hope of his supporters for the sake of some empty abstraction. If a candidate believes in an agenda, he should pursue it politically, without rest and without apology. Although apologies, strategically offered, can be a means of pursuing it. And then he concludes with this comment: I would make this recommendation strongly were I not absolutely sure that everyone was following it anyway. And I want to read one more sentence from this interesting article, because in one sentence he gives his reason, his rationale, his philosophy for this point of view. It's a very interesting sentence. Practicing politics as usual is what everyone always does and should do, because politics is the only vehicle by which our substantive visions, our visions of what is right and good for the country and for the world, can be realized. Well, this is from yesterday's newspaper from the dean at the University of Illinois, a perfect description of the worldview, the way of seeing the country, the way of seeing ourselves, that I am calling the triumph of politics. It used to be that people who had this philosophy were on the margins of our society. They were the dissenters. They were the people who were very much in the minority. And now we make these people deans of major colleges. And so, where does this idea come from? The idea that the highest sphere of our social life is politics. It's a very old idea. The scholars have discussed, debate to what degree the ancient world, the Greco-Roman societies, had this principle that life's highest questions were political questions, ultimately solved by the state. But they have this notion of a unitary principle of society. The word that you may have heard that some scholars use, the word is, they call it monism. Monism. Monism means in one guiding principle. That's the highest. One. Not a diversity of principles. And what I think you all were taught, this is based on my conversations with some of you, were taught in your freshman and sophomore years when you read the books, the great books. Modern Western societies have broke decisively with this monistic understanding. How? We disestablished religion, religious freedom, separation of church and state means that separate from the sphere of politics, over and above, arching over the sphere of politics is what I want to call the moral umbrella. It's what Peter Berger calls a moral canopy. That's where I got the image of, literally think of a canvas or an umbrella of moral thought and moral truth that is overarching political activity. That was the break in the Western tradition from monism, from the principle that politics was the highest. Politics was the umbrella. The Western Christian tradition says there is a moral umbrella over and above the political. What is the moral umbrella? Well, it's familiar to all of us. It's what the founders referred to them as self-evident truths. The founders referred to this moral umbrella as the law of nature and nature's God. Think of Washington's farewell address. Think of Lincoln's second inaugural and the Gettysburg Address. Think of Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, where he refers to the what he called higher law, and what earlier philosophers and thinkers have called natural law. King called it higher law. It's on our coins. The simplest embodiment of it is on our coins. It says, "In God we trust," the principle of the external moral standard or umbrella. What's interesting about it is that politics doesn't define it. You don't derive the moral code from political activity. On the contrary, political activity largely draws its legitimacy from the moral umbrella. It is, in a sense, obedient to the moral umbrella. That's the idea. And that is what I want to tell you. This is my thesis to you, that in the last 10 years of our public life, the single most important trend in our public life has been the removal of the moral umbrella and the principle of what I'm calling the triumph of politics. I want to give you some examples. You've heard the term politically correct. Usually, when people say it today, conservatives often use the term as a criticism. They say, "Oh, you're being politically correct." It's an accusation. I was active on the left in the 1970s, and I remember a time in the mid to late 70s when we on the left used the term politically correct to refer to ourselves in a positive way. It was what we wanted to be. We made up the phrase. I didn't personally, but I used it in a positive way. There was a hint of irony in it. Stanley Fish is big on irony too. A hint of irony in a somewhat distancing. You would grin a little bit in a knowing way when you would say it, but you essentially meant it in a positive way. What did it mean? It meant that you had an opinion, or you had an understanding of the facts of the matter that served your political agenda. You had an opinion or an understanding of the factitude of things that correctly corresponded to what was politically desirable. That's the whole idea of the phrase. This idea has a very strong lineage on the political left. If you go back to the 1930s, the phrase "the party line," the Communist Party had this, the party line. That is, one's views of current events were governed by whatever the official political goal of the day was, and it was called having the party line. Most famously exemplified and most notoriously exemplified in the Hitler-Stalin Pact at the early parts of World War II, where one day the party line was one position on the war, and then after the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the very next day, on one night's sleep, it completely changed. Why? Not because because the political agenda had changed. And if you go further back to the writings with the great socialist intellectual tradition, Marx and plenty of others, there's a very strong train of thought that says that what Professor Fish calls an abstraction, things like the rule of law, truth-telling, and so on, are illusory. They're illusory. What do they cover over the true reality? What is the true reality? The true reality is the struggle for power. That is the true reality. And these illusions, such as truth-telling, rule of law, civility, they are masks that confuse us as to the true nature of our condition. This is the triumph of politics. It has a very intellectually, a very vibrant tradition going back a long way, but in terms of the modern Western world, it has, I believe, strong origins on the left within the socialist intellectual tradition. But what I want to say to you today is this is across the board. See, my argument is across the board. And I want to give you some examples from across the board. The rise of Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House, I believe, is a wonderful example of the triumph of politics. You may remember he became Speaker of the House in large measure because he relentlessly attacked the then Speaker Jim Wright, brought charge after charge, shocked many of his colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and eventually ended the career of Speaker Wright on some charge, and who even remembers the details? Suffice it to say, it was all fairly trivial. He got rid of the guy. He becomes Speaker. And then, because turnabout in these matters is fair play, he too was taken down in a way that, if anything, was more brutal, more openly cynical, more about nothing other than the naked pursuit of political power by a guy named David Bonyer, who simply announced the day Gingrich became Speaker that he was simply going to charge and charge and charge and make accusation and accusation until he got him, until he took him down. And it worked. Who can even remember what the thing finally was? Suffice it to say, it was completely trivial. But he got him, and he sank him. And that was the end of that. I would say that the prosecutorial culture in Washington, where everything gets turned into a personal investigation, including the investigations endlessly of President Clinton, beginning before he even took office, the relentless pursuit of him through special prosecutors and so on, I believe is part of the triumph of politics. That is the belief that any tool at your disposal to get your political enemy is fair because that's the highest goal there is, winning politically. I would say that the end of what I would call the idea of the Senate of the United States is another example of the triumph of politics. There was a time, some of you may know this from history or from personal memory, when being a senator was different from being a member of the House. There was a sense that in the Senate you were supposed to be more disinterested, you were not supposed to be caught up in the partisan passions. The House of Representatives was supposed to be more openly partisan, more focused on the particular district. Senators were supposed to take the broader view. There was an elaborate code of collegiality and courtesy that governed almost to people who don't know why it exists or why it used to exist. It sounds comical, very elaborate and courteous ways of addressing one another, long-winded ways about my esteemed colleague. This was a part of a code that was to differentiate the Senate from the House. That is gone completely, completely. There is no distinction anymore in this arena of civility and partisanship between the House and the Senate. This would be shocking to the founders, and it is shocking to me, and it is what I would call the end of the idea of the Senate. When Senator Moynihan retired, and there's one or two left from the old way, but the new way is the Gingrich way, and it's now across the board. I'm using Republican examples because it would be easy for me to use Democratic examples, and maybe you would be more amenable to them, but I'm looking for Republican examples of this trend as well because it's across the board. That's my thesis to you. This is a societal bipartisan trend, even though intellectually and politically it has originated on the socialist left. The most famous example of this, of course, in our decade has been President Clinton. The most famous single illustration of it is when the Monica thing first broke, when he first brazenly lied about it to the nation and to his cabinet. and his pollster, Dick Morris, came to him and said, "Mr. President, we've done polling on this. They're likely to give you some slack on the adultery issue, but they really, really are going to be upset if they found out that you have brazenly lied about it." And Clinton famously remarked, "Well, we'll just have to win. We'll just have to win." Meaning, he would continue brazenly to lie in order to win politically. Why? Because in his view, and in the view that I'm describing as the triumph of politics, standing firm for your political agenda, whether it be universal health care or lower taxes or whatever good thing you think is going to help make the world a better place, that is the highest value. And other values, including telling the truth, are subordinate to that value. We'll just have to win. Take down the Speaker of the House over some triviality. The most important thing is to win. Call your colleagues names, put up misleading advertisements about them, make wild suggestions that have very little to do with anything other than trying to destroy them. The thing is to win. Why? Because the value of the political agenda is the highest value. James Carville, the principal advisor to President Clinton, wrote a book about this very topic. It's called All's Fair. All's Fair. He co-wrote it with Mary Matlin, who's a Republican. All's fair. What's the philosophy? The philosophy is that the most important thing is politics, and everything goes in terms of advancing the political agenda. And that's clearly what President Clinton believes, and and I think if you look at Florida today, right now, at 11:15 in the morning, that's what we're seeing in the state of Florida right now. The election ends. You don't like the election results? You send down lawyers, you send down spinners, you raise a bunch of money and start having a continuation of the political campaign in order to overturn the results of the first one and get your desired result in a second. I'm saying this, I hope, in impartial manner. I'm actually a lifelong Democrat. But I say this because it is shocking to me the degree to which we are now willing to we're all Fishites, you know? We all agree with Stanley Fish that the only thing that matters is winning. And so you set up a war room. The day after the election, you set up a war room. And you send down spinners, and you send down lawyers, and you start raising funds for a political campaign, and you start having rallies with people chanting and screaming as though there was still an election, because there is an election, because the point is you don't accept the results of the election because they represent a political defeat. So you simply say, no, we're continuing to fight until we win. The two main words here are very interesting words. You want 90s words? I don't know if they're going to be the words for this century, but there are two interesting words in our politics from the 90s. Fighting and spinning. Fighting. I'll fight for you. I'm fighting this. Stand and fight. We're fighting for this. We're fighting for that. Interesting word. It's been focus grouped and it comes out well, so every politician wants to fight. Who are they fighting? What is this fight that we're all being asked to enroll in? We're asking to fight each other. We're fighting our fellow citizens. There's no one else to fight. That's who the fight is. The fight is against our political opponents. Spinning used to be a word that was not used. Do you remember a time when this was not a word? Now it's come into the mainstream, and it's a reputable vocation now, which means shading the truth for political gain. And if you turn on, anytime you turn on television, that's what you see, spinning. And it's seen as normal, respectable. For you younger people here, I promise you there was a time when it was practiced, but it was not respectable. And it was honored more in the breach than in the observance. And now, what's wrong with this? Well, I want to say that there are three things that the moral umbrella does. Again, this notion of the biblically and religiously derived moral umbrella, the moral code, the natural moral law, the moral canopy, the truths, the self-evident truths. I want to take a moment to say the three things that this umbrella does, because you can't really, I don't think I can understand why its removal is damaging unless I understand what is the positive role of this moral overlay to politics that we are losing today. And I want to say that the moral umbrella has previously done, when it existed, three things. Number one, it underwrites social well-being. It underwrites our flourishing as competent people. It civilizes us. These moral truths, if you want to say moral truths, civilize us by teaching us to govern our appetites, teaching us to transcend selfishness, teaching us, most importantly, to understand freedom as an ethical condition. Freedom is the central idea of America. Freedom is the central civic end of America. Freedom. It is only the moral canopy that forces us to view freedom not simply as immunity from restraint, but as an ethical condition, as the morally defined mean between license and slavery. It is only the moral code that compels us to view freedom in this ethical way. Otherwise, freedom simply means immunity from restraint. The founders were very clear that this ethical conception of freedom was essential for self-governing people. Go back and read the Federalist Papers and look at the constant view of Madison, especially the other founders, that democracy required citizens of competence, character, virtue to a higher degree than any other form of government. Why? Because in unfree societies, you have the king or the ruler who tells you what to do. But in free societies, each of us, there is no king, there is no ruler. Each of us must carry around a piece of the king in our head and in our hearts. We break the king into 1,000 pieces, and each of us has a little piece inside. That's what it means to be a self-governing people. And that means that is a rigorous aspiration. And it requires competence and character to a higher degree than other forms of government. And so the founders were both worried and very convinced that the moral umbrella, the moral canopy, was the guarantor ultimately of political freedom. Again, this is the theme of the lecture, that because it generated citizens of competence and character. Politics itself does not do this kind of generation of social and moral capital. This is a very important point to remember. You can't derive your morality from politics. It doesn't work that way. Politics has to be subordinate to the moral canopy. Secondly, the moral umbrella underwrites political freedom by limiting the power and reach of the state. Under a unitary system where politics is the highest, another way of saying that is that life's most important questions are political questions ultimately decided by government. It is a situation where government decision derived politically is the highest level of conclusion about life's basic questions. The Western tradition which separates, which ends monism and separates the political and the religious, creating a moral umbrella over and above the political, relativizes politics. It makes politics less important because it subordinates politics to a moral canopy that politics itself did not create. And thereby it limits the power of the state. So it is essential in the realm for those who believe in political freedom. Political freedom depends upon the moral canopy. It depends upon moral truth. If you lose the moral canopy, you evaporate the basis upon which a free society sustains itself. Thirdly, and these are all closely related points, but I think they're worth distinguishing, at least analytically. The moral umbrella underwrites the rationale for civic engagement. You probably have done some reading about the whole notion that we don't join things like we used to, we're less civically involved. The famous book by Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, we're not a society of joiners or participators anymore. But there is a much deeper question. Think about two questions that have to do with the prerequisites for civic involvement. Why you would want to vote, why you would want to be a part of political life at all. Why would you want to? Here are two questions worth asking yourself. One is, why is my opponent not my enemy? Why is my opponent not my enemy? You know, if my opponent was my enemy, and he had something I wanted, like money, or a woman, or political power, or a piece of land, why don't I just cut his throat and take what I want? If he is my enemy, there's no reason why I shouldn't. Why is my opponent not my enemy? In our tradition, it is because I believe of my opponent that he possesses equal dignity. He is, in religious terms, because we are all created by God and we are created in the likeness and image of God, we are all endowed with equal human dignity, transcendent human dignity that does not derive from government, that derives from our status as being created by God. In the secular or natural law language, the notion of natural rights tells us a similar story. This is why the founders described as self-evident these men that were heavily influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, described as self-evident the proposition that all are created equal, that they possess equal human dignity. My friends, that is the only reason that my opponent is not my enemy. And if you do not believe that moral thesis about the human person, then there is no reason at all to treat someone as an opponent, not an enemy, to make the distinction between the two. The second question is, why be involved in politics and civic life at all? Why even bother to have debate? Why even bother to argue about what we should do and what law we should pass? The answer ultimately is because we believe that truth exists and that truth is accessible to people of goodwill. We believe that there is a moral truth out there that we know only imperfectly, but that exists, and that people of goodwill can reason together to find out what it is. If you don't believe that, that is, if you don't believe in the existence of the moral umbrella, there is absolutely no reason to engage anybody in discussion at all about anything, because it's all an abstraction, an illusion. This was the single worst thing about Clinton's lying, because for public officials to lie brazenly to their fellow citizens is to attack at the essence, at the very foundation, the rationale for democratic society. If you eliminate the trust that we are going to try to speak the truth to one another, if that goes, there is no reason to discuss anything. There is only a reason to fight. That is the deepest corruption of the last generation in our politics. The summary of what I'm trying to tell you, what I'm trying to say in this thesis, this proposition to you, that if the moral umbrella goes away, all that is left is power. All that is left is the struggle for power. I think that's what we're seeing in Florida today. I think it's the single most important trend in American public life. I think it's deeply disturbing. And I think back to our friend Professor Fish, Dean Fish, if you want to know the implications of it for education, if you want to know the implications of this point of view for learning, we need look no further than, again, I just saw this last night. This is from a major university, the American University. It's part of an increasingly circulated code of classroom discussion. So at the beginning of the class, you get this sheet of paper, and here's what it says. It tells you guidelines for discussion of the topic. This happens to be a sociology class. And here they are. We will assume that this is a class about, I don't know what it's even about. It's something about, class, gender, something, or, I mean, just what they're all about these days. We will assume that all of us have been influenced by racism, by the racism of our culture. We will acknowledge that oppression exists. We will acknowledge that one of the mechanisms of oppression is that we are all taught misinformation about gender, race, and class. This is true for both dominant and subordinate group members. And this is the final guideline for discussion. We cannot be blamed for the misinformation we learned, but we will be held responsible for repeating misinformation after we have learned otherwise. Well, if that doesn't send a chill up your spine, I'd say we're all in more trouble than we know. That level of brutality about telling people in advance that a deviant view is not permitted, being taught in advance in terms of issuing ground rules for discussion, that there is a politically proper conclusion to be transmitted to the students which they are to accept without questioning at the risk of being excluded from the acceptable community. That's what this kind of classroom discussion code is. And it is brutal. And it is the enemy of intellectual inquiry. It is the enemy of the Western intellectual tradition. It is the enemy of the notion of inquiry. It is the enemy of the notion of some sense of a moral umbrella that is more important than simply hammering into students who cannot do otherwise but accept the political thoughts that are being transmitted to them. This is the consequence intellectually of Dean Fish's point of view, that there is nothing in life other than pursuing one's political agenda. Because after all, why be bothered by abstractions such as intellectual inquiry, such as freedom of debate, such as the freedom of the human mind to pursue truth? Why be bothered by such abstractions when the important thing in life, indeed the only important goal, as he puts it, the only vehicle for pursuing a substantive vision of the good is through politics? So obviously the goal is to politicize the classroom, just as the goal is to politicize the legal system and every other system, because the political sphere is the highest sphere. To speak in religious terms, it is God. It is that is the thing that we worship because it is our highest. It is our highest. There is nothing higher. And so the other things, if other things must go down in the service of that ultimate truth claim, then other things will go down. And they will go down in the universities just as they go down in the courts and in other places. Well, what is to be done about this state of affairs? I think what is to be done is to, argue against it. To argue against it. I once asked a friend of mine who I think is pretty smart about these matters, and I'm in the think tank business, and I said, this is a guy named Richard Newhouse who runs a magazine called First Things. I said, what is the big thing that we're doing here? What are we trying to do here? What's the purpose? And he said, the purpose is to force moral debate, to do everything we can to force not force in a physical sense, but to, with argument and with ideas, to try to foster an ethical discussion about these matters. And if you want fighting words, if you want a motto to go into this ethical discussion with, try these words: moral truth exists. Now, we are imperfect people. We see in a glass darkly. We don't know what the truth is. I don't believe I know what the truth is. I know that I am short-sighted. I believe that I fail every day in understanding the truth of things. But I do believe that moral truth exists. In other words, it exists objectively, but my only access to it is subjective. So I have to go into it with a sense of humility, a sense of civility, a sense that when you and I differ about these things, I'm to treat you as an opponent, not an enemy. I'm to listen to you carefully because you may have an understanding of it that I lack. But I'm to understand ultimately that this is in the service of something that is the external, something that is the moral umbrella, something that is true about who we are and where we ought to go. If we lose that, all that's left is power. And I think in terms of what you all are doing here at Hillsdale, from what I'm able to understand, you have the possibility maybe to carry into the next generation an argument which my generation has really made a mess of. Because if you want fighting words, if you want to go on most other campuses in the country and you want to be either just laughed at or ignored, or maybe somebody will send the people with the white suit people to carry you away for being completely crazy. You just tell them that moral truth exists and see how far you get. So it's an uphill battle, but I think that what you're doing here at Hillsdale is part of the solution, and I hope that you will, I wish you all the best as you go out and try to, I hope, participate in this civil, intellectually serious, morally informed discussion about whether or not politics is the highest or whether or not there's a moral canopy over us. I think that's the major debate. That's the major debate upon which all the other questions ultimately depend. Thank you very much.
We have 15 minutes.
Thank you for your comments. I think they're well taken. The moral truth is revealed by God in the Bible, and that is the Ten Commandments. So while we see in a glass darkly, the Ten Commandments are our guide and our analytical tool for determining truth. Your comments on that would be appreciated.
Yes, I believe that's true. And the Ten Commandments are the probably the primary, substantive basis of the moral umbrella, certainly in the West. I only wanted to stress, because I think it's important to stress, to me, it's important to get the balance right on this question. I don't have a lot of patience with, well, I'll put it this way. Václav Havel, maybe some of you will disagree with this. Václav Havel once said that he would rather have a beer with someone who was looking for the truth than with someone who had found it. And I agree with that. I would rather have a beer with someone who was looking for it than with someone who had found it. I don't have much patience with people who say they found it and they know what it is and that's that. Because I do believe that our access to this is imperfect. I believe in what one of the great philosophers called the noetic effects of sin. And I just don't think that any of us know what the truth is. And it puts me, that's where I part company with some of my friends on this matter. So that's why I meant to say that there has to be a certain humility about this and a certain tendency to resist trying to lecture people with such definitude as to about what exactly it all is. At the same time, the greatest danger in our age is the opposite danger. The greatest danger in our age, in this generation at least, has been the notion that not only do we not all know what it is, but we, according to Professor Fish and many others, Republicans and Democrats, North, South, East, and West, there isn't any such thing. It doesn't exist at all, and therefore people who say it are just, it's just another form of political struggle. That's what I think the great danger is. But I do part company with some of my friends who otherwise would be on my side on this point when I do say that there's a certain humility and openness to other points of view that we have to go into this with.
Thank you. If winning isn't everything, how does that leave you feeling about career politicians?
Well, I don't really have any problem with career politicians, but as long as they act as though what they're doing is constrained by something larger than their own political agenda. And it may be easier to find people who feel that way if they're not career politicians, but on the other hand, as I say, the trend I'm trying to describe to you today, I believe it is deep and broad. I don't believe that you can divide the world into let's just say the conservatives who don't believe in the triumph of politics and the left that does believe. I don't believe it's that simple. I believe that this has affected us all, and career politicians as well as people who aren't career politicians. I believe it is a bipartisan societal shift. And but your point is well taken. Perhaps career politicians would be even more likely than to believe in the religion of politics.
Your discussion seemed pretty bleak. Do you have much hope for the defeat of this political monism? And if so, do you think that this will occur most likely from a grassroots effort of just people discussing that truth does exist and that going up? Or do you think that this will actually occur in the political realm?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen about this. I do think it's the greatest threat to the American experiment today. On the other hand, we're doing pretty well by a lot of indicators. We're richer than we could have possibly imagined, even a few short years ago, and the envy of the world, and there are a lot of things, wonderful things to say about this American experiment. But I do believe the single greatest threat to it, its long-term health, is this triumph of politics and the erosion of the moral canopy. I don't know whether it can be turned around. However, again, not to keep quoting Václav Havel, but I hope you read some of his essays sometime. he once said there was a difference between optimism and hope. He said optimism was the belief that things will work out for the best, and hope is the belief that certain things are worth doing regardless of how things work out. And I think there's an important, I would say I'm not very optimistic about turning this trend around, but I'm hopeful because hope is ultimately what the theologians call a theological virtue. It's a spiritual orientation rather than based on an assessment of empirical data. It's a condition of the heart. And so I think it's our calling to be hopeful that certain things are worth doing regardless of how they turn out. And sometimes they turn out in ways that we couldn't have predicted. In fact, usually they do. Havel himself in the mid-1970s was an unemployed, he was in jail, and the communist government in his country, Czechoslovakia, was, ruling with the tanks, and it was a terrible mess, and there was absolutely no reason for optimism. And he wrote a wonderful letter to the Communist General Secretary, and I would suggest if you wanted to read one beautiful piece of writing on this subject, read his letter to it's called Letter to Dr. Hughes. I think it ranks with the letter from the Birmingham jail and a couple of others as one of the great letters of our century. And he makes this, he basically says that the communist system is corrupt and it corrupts people and therefore it should end. And he basically calls on the guy to resign. And of course the guy says, oh, he doesn't have time to read his letter. But then 10 years later, Havel is the president of the country, and the whole thing happened in the most improbable way. So you never know. You just never know how things are going to turn out. And we can't base our actions on a prediction of how things are going to happen. So the only way to do it is to do it with this virtue of hope, asking for the virtue of hope and seeking after it as best we can so that we can do what Faulkner called make our little mark on the face of humanity in a way that is hopeful. And so irrespective of how we think it's ultimately going to turn out. And I think that's really, for your generation, to me, that's what I hope you will do.
Are there still politicians today that you see as not following this triumph of politics? And also wondering if you could comment on Senator Ashcroft's election race and how that turned out.
Well, sure, there are politicians today. They're just fewer and fewer in number. I thought that Senator Ashcroft, who's a man I've known for some time, and I thought what he did exemplify what I'm trying to uphold as a good thing. For those of you who may not remember or didn't follow it, he was his opponent died during several weeks prior to the election, and it was a neck-and-neck race, and his opponent died, and tragically and suddenly, and they voted in his opponent. His opponent, who was dead, won the election, and the widow of the opponent is now going to take a seat in the United States Senate as the elected senator from Missouri, and Ashcroft has lost. And a lot of his advisors said, well, the Constitution of the state says that the winner has to be an inhabitant of the state. And since your opponent, who is deceased, cannot be in any reasonable legal sense be called an inhabitant of the state, he didn't win. You can't have a dead person win an election. And therefore, legally speaking, you're the winner. And you could prevail on this in court. And he said, that may well be true, but I'm not going to do it because the people in a movement of generosity and sympathy and a sense of strong feelings over the tragedy of this death, essentially voted in his widow, who had no political experience and no one even knew who she was. They just voted her in. And so he stepped down, and he didn't do what Vice President Gore calls stand and fight. He stepped down and made a gracious speech, and a lot of his Republican allies think he's foolish for not fighting this out, and he maybe could have prevailed in court. So I think that was a rare example in a contemporary politician of simply refusing this idea that politics is everything and politics is the ultimate, and that there were certain things more important to Senator Ashcroft than whether or not he won. And a sense of decency and generosity toward this widow, and a sense that the election, there was something almost sacred about the process of the election itself, that those issues were more important than whether or not he won. And so I think that's a very good example, and I'm glad you brought it up, of something that, but I'll tell you, you need a search warrant today to find people who act that way. Can you think of another one, another person? It's hard.
Now, where I am from, in the public school system, the umbrella has been folded up, and morality has been put in the same category with religion, and therefore it is not encouraged, and in many cases it is not allowed. What advice would you give to a teacher desiring to uphold moral values?
Well, of course, as you know, and as your question implies, morality and religion are not the same thing. Morality is a code of how we ought to behave toward one another. Religion is an answer to the question of who are we? How did we get here? What is our ultimate ordination in life? And those are two separate questions. They're obviously closely related, but they're two separate questions. And the thing that I feel is that an educated person, part of being an educated child or an educated person is to be familiar with the moral canopy of one's society and the traditions, the moral traditions and teachings. And similarly, part of being an educated person is to understand the role of religion in culture and in society. Most of the anthropologists would tell us that at the heart of culture is religion, and so you're simply not an educated person if you're kept in ignorance about those matters. And so my thought is that there may be some shift in our society now toward a more of a willingness in schools not to teach religion, which would violate the separation of church and state, but to teach about religion, to simply say that an educated person needs to understand intellectually these foundations of his culture or her culture. Obviously, the most important book in the history of the West is the Bible. And so if you want to understand anything about your society, why would educators force you to be ignorant about the most important book? As a matter of being an educated person, and I think that there are some changes in the Clinton Justice Department several years ago. If you're a teacher, I'm sure you're familiar with this, they actually they disseminated some regulations that made it very clear that while it was not proper for teachers to instruct their children as to the correct religious beliefs, that it was permissible to teach students about religion. And I also feel at the level of morality, it is a good thing to communicate to students that there is this, in our society, this moral umbrella, which is a separate question from religion. It does come from Judaism and Christianity. It also comes from the Enlightenment. It comes from natural law theory. And it's pretty interesting as a matter of learning about things to find out where it came, but it's there. And understanding it and being asked to think about it and reflect upon how it should affect one's life, I think is a perfectly good function of education. And I do hope that perhaps we can make some progress on that in the schools.